I now have the great honor and pleasure of helping facilitate the ongoing conversation through an interview with Judith Plaskow, a very important feminist foremother, whom we managed to feature in the PowerPoint presentation, and who gets to be a member of our faculty and our community over the course of this next semester, and we're so grateful to you. Before we move into this part of the program, I just wanted to say a few thank yous, because the 20 minutes that you just witnessed were a long labor of collaboration, and each person who was involved in this project needs to be acknowledged. So first, I want to say thank you in absentia to Dr. Gail Reamer and Dr. Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive, based in Boston. These two important scholars and dedicated feminists worked very hard with us, just out of the love and the shared conviction for these feminist principles, and helped provide us with some of the documents that we featured in the PowerPoint, and to respond, to participated in conference calls, and we're looking forward to being able to host Dr. Gail Reamer later on in the year as a way of continuing the energy and the achievement of this Kallah. I also wanted to, again, thank Dr. Judith Plaskow, who I'm going to formally introduce in a moment, and the student committee that participated in the creation of this PowerPoint, some of whom really did a chesed shel emet, in that they did this work, and they're not even here because they have responsibilities for Wexner or what have you, and they were willing to prepare this presentation without even having the benefit of witnessing it themselves. They include Adina Kemper, Daniel and Jessica Kurzane, who isn't even one of our students, she helped, Jody Gordon, Susan Landau, and Susie Lewis-Friedman, who actually was one of our readers, and our panel of readers included Amy Goodman, Susie Lewis-Friedman, Brandon Bernstein, Betsy Miller, and Dr. Rabbi Aaron Pink. So for those of you who, I don't know how this could be possible, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the work of Judith Plaskow, this is who she is. Judith Plaskow is Professor Emerita of Religious Studies at Manhattan College, and a Jewish feminist theologian who has been teaching, writing, and speaking about feminist theology for 40 years. 40 years is an important kufa. There are a number, we're celebrating the 40-year milestone of a number of important moments. 40 years since the ordination of women in the Reform movement, 40 years since Debbie Friedman's Sing Unto God, 40 years since Ezrat Nashim made their protest for the conservative movement, and 40 years since the world was graced with Judith Plaskow's work. Co-founder and co-editor of the Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion, she is author or editor of several works in feminist theology, including Standing Again at Sinai, Judaism from a Feminist Perspective, and The Coming of Lilith, Essays on Feminism, Judaism, and Sexual Ethics, 1972 to 2003. She's currently working on a book on God and feminism with her friend and important feminist theologian in her own right, Carol P. Christ, and we're just so delighted to be able to have her with us today. So part of the joy of planning this program is that I've been able to have a series of extended conversations with Judith. And so in part this will be an interview, but in part it may turn out to be a conversation as we watch the clock. But before we get into the formal questions that are really an outgrowth of the PowerPoint presentation and the major feminist themes that we wanted to present in the PowerPoint, I just want to give Judith an opportunity to talk a little bit about herself, her personal background, how it is that you came to your life's work and your ideological commitments.
I grew up in a classical Reform congregation on Long Island. I went through 12 years of religious school. And I was really an oddball in that I was interested in religious questions from the time I was really small. And certainly by post-confirmation, I was the only kid in the school who was there, not under duress. I wanted to be a rabbi when I was an adolescent, but there were no women who were rabbis. My own rabbi was opposed to the ordination of women because it was against tradition. You know, this in a congregation where a man was been asked to take his kippah off if he didn't want one. But my sophomore year of college, I had an epiphany at the end of NILA that I could go and get a doctorate in religious studies. That seemed completely simple to me, but I'm not being a rabbi. I wanted to be a theologian, but at the time that I applied to graduate school, there was nowhere in the country where you could study Jewish theology. So I went to Yale, and it was really a toxic environment for women. I mean, there was not yet the concept of a hostile work environment, but that's what it was. It was very difficult to be a female student. And my second year, Yale admitted women to the undergraduate college and began to prepare for the education of women by putting full-length mirrors in the bathroom. And three female graduate students called a meeting to discuss how it was that we'd been in Yale for 80 years and no one had noticed. And we began meeting weekly for consciousness raising. And over the course of that year, I became and Carol Priest, who was the other woman in contemporary theology, was part of that group. And so it just emerged very naturally that we started applying our new insights to our work and asking, well, how come we never read a single thing by a woman in any of our courses? I mean, we hadn't noticed that before we became feminists.
So one of the important things to realize as we, bask in the glow of the achievement of our female faculty members and in the mainstream prominence of women in the reform movement is how far we've come, and not take that for granted. I think that there's a tendency, because we've achieved so much in these areas of leadership, to assume that these ideas are been there, done that, and yet we notice that there's a kind of cyclical progress to the way ideas develop, and with advance as well as regress, and the need constantly to kind of renew, go back to the well and renew, do our own consciousness raising in this regard. So one of the themes that we intentionally engaged for this PowerPoint presentation was the theme of the personal as political, which is something that continues to dominate feminist consciousness. So certainly we're in an election year. As we were planning for the Kallah, we were recognizing that this was not purely an academic set of concerns, but that the whole question of feminism's gains and whether these would continue to be gains, there's going to be a national referendum on many of these issues come November. And so I wanted to ask you, Judith, how this insight about the personal as political, how it has impacted your own scholarly or your own personal life.
Well, it was that insight that the personal is the political was hugely important to our consciousness raising process. We didn't have that slogan yet, but really what consciousness raising was about was looking at our lives and recognizing that what we thought were our personal problems were really the result of our socialization as women. So I had been told my whole life that I was too smart for a girl, and that if I wanted to get a man, I had to dumb down. And I think it was important that my first consciousness raising group was with other graduate women at Yale, because every single person in the group had been told that. And that was one of those light bulbs going off, that this wasn't about us, this was about the society that needed to be changed. So I think the personal as the political originally meant that when we analyze our individual lives, it helps us to understand the larger social structures that shape our experience. So if I take the issue of work-life balance, people have trouble with balance not because they can't get their act together, but because of the way that work is defined in our society. And I think the meaning of that slogan kind of been turned on its head. that, you know, if I refuse to get the ketchup from the refrigerator, when my husband asks, then I'm being political. And maybe that's important, but that isn't what it meant. So I think that understanding that our personal
It depends
lives...
on how important ketchup is for you.
Right. You know, that understanding that our personal experiences are shaped by larger social structures has been crucial to my work.
And as a theologian, have you found a special application for that? Or is this something, you know, how do we think the personal as political translates into the God sphere?
Well, how do our concepts of God shape our self-understandings as women and men? But I mean, actually, one night when I was about 8 or 9, it suddenly occurred to me as I was falling asleep that God might be a woman. And I can remember hugging that insight to myself, just lying there sort of in jubilation for about 20 minutes before I fell asleep. And then I forgot about it until I was a graduate student. But it says, what did it mean to me as a little girl to be so excited and so affirmed by that insight?
That you had in your room.
That I had by myself.
So among the 5 themes that we investigated was the whole question of feminist forebears. And we elected to call it Feminist Forbears rather than our foremothers, so as to try and expand the definition of what sort of history we can avail ourselves of to strengthen our feminist agenda, and it may not always have to be embodied in a feminine form. So I was wondering if you could comment for us on how you see your feminist, you know, who were your feminist forebears when you were beginning your work, and has this changed over the years? I enjoyed very much sitting with our bonding group, what do we call that? Getting to know you group. One of the male students here reflected on how his grandmother was his feminist role model, because she built their farmhouse all by herself, and it wasn't until he went to school that he actually found out that wasn't typical. So sometimes our forebears come in unexpected packages.
You know, I think when we who started doing feminist work in religion in the early 70s started, we didn't feel like we had forebears. We felt like we were making it up as we went along, and that was both ignorant and arrogant in a way. But you know, Rosemary Ruther said we felt like we were picking up the ground on which we were standing, that we were questioning everything. That sense that, you know, people hadn't done that before. But then quite quickly I began to realize that wasn't true. I found Valerie Saving's article from 1960, the Human Situation of Feminine View, in which she criticized 2 major male theologians for writing from a male perspective. And it was just incredibly exciting to realize that someone had raised this question a decade earlier. In 1974, there was a session at the American Academy of Religion on the Women's Bible, and you know, I can remember my head exploding, how exciting that there were these feminists who've been asking similar questions 100 years ago.
So the Women's Bible was, I mean, most people know about Elizabeth Cady Stanton's contribution to feminism, the first wave of feminism in the United States, but aren't familiar with the fact that she was the pioneering, the first feminist Bible critic in being the editor of the Women's Bible in 1895, I believe. So it really wasn't until Andrea Weiss and Tamara Eskenazi came along and to answer some of the glaring anti-Semitic problems with the Women's Bible, that we had a proper Jewish version of that. But I remember having the same feeling reading the Women's Bible and realizing that the insight that religion was not a sphere where people could remain neutral. If they wanted to affect far-reaching change in politics, that they couldn't leave religion as this sacred well, to borrow from another culture, cow, that could not be engaged. But they had to, undertake a very dangerous sort of enterprise. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton was pretty much marginalized or ostracized for the fact that she was willing to take on the Bible the way she did. So I remember very clearly the experience of reading Standing Again at Sinai and your call for the creation of Feminist Midrash as an answer to the lack of feminist forebears. Because at the time I was engaged in research about early women writers who in a sense had been doing some of that before Americans really knew, but that it was so crucial for women to invent in a way, in the same way that the rabbis had invented stories to fill in what they considered to be lacking in biblical text, but to invent their commentary. So I was wondering how you feel about the progress of that enterprise, given that you were one of the people who made a clarion call for it, whether you feel that much of the work has been done or whether you still see the need for more feminist forebear creation.
It's incredibly exciting to me to see the tremendous amount of work that's been done over the last several decades, and I think there's always room for more, but it's really gratifying. And when people say to me, I read your book and I went out and did X, there's nothing more exciting than that.
When I was in Israel this summer, I picked up a book called Dirshuni, which is a compilation of midrashim written by Israeli women who are either clergy or academics across the spectrum. And these are midrashim that are actually crafted along the lines of rabbinic midrash. So they show a tremendous amount of erudition. And Dahlia Marks, who's one of our faculty members, she contributed. So your work has translated, or at least your call has very much been heeded. The next theme I wanted to ask you about was confronting power. Can you comment on the experience that you had confronting power and in the academy and the religious establishment? I remember when we were speaking on the phone, you talked about how your early experience entering into feminist theology was like knocking on the door and waiting to be let in. And so can you explain what you meant by that?
Sure. Well, let me say that becoming a feminist immediately led me into confrontations with power. At the time I was at Yale, there was a male-only club that a lot of male undergraduates and graduate students belonged to, and the law school interviewed at that club. So female law students could not have interviews with firms that interviewed there. So one of the first things that we did when we started forming a group was to picket more. So immediately, we got involved with that. And then I was involved in the American Academy of Religion Women's Caucus from early on, and we would pack the annual business meeting every year and make motions from the floor. So we should meet in states that hadn't passed the Equal Rights Amendment or whatever. I've been a Havaraju my whole adult life, so I feel like I functioned on the margins of the Jewish community, so that my confrontation with the religious establishment has happened more in print than in person. And it's easy to write great things and then retreat behind the printed word. But what I was referring to when I talked about knocking on the door was really an internal struggle. In 1980, I wrote The Right Question is Theological, in which I laid out a critique of the central Jewish categories of Torah, God, and Israel, and called for a complete rethinking of them from a feminist perspective. Well, I hadn't the faintest idea how to do that. I just knew that it needed to be done, and I certainly didn't think I had a right to do it. I mean, I didn't know anything. Who was I to begin to rethink these categories? And so it was like if I stated that it needed to be done, then they the people with knowledge and power had to then create the changes. And so it was a very difficult process to feel authorized to begin to step into the abyss and begin that rethinking.
So that offers a very good transition to my next question, which is the inherent tension on the one hand between women or disenfranchised entities, assuming authority and assuming power, and on the other hand, wanting to do away with those categories to begin with, and to level those hierarchies, and to work towards collaboration. And so how do we do that? On the one hand, you need to assume authority. You need to become authors. You know, you have to assume the power of the pen, and yet you're in many respects adopting a set of tools, you know, the master's tools. So how do we negotiate that? How do we create a liberal or left approach to power, where we assert it unabashedly when we need it, but on the other hand, undermine it because we think that it's part of the problem?
Well, but isn't the question how you use the power that you point? I mean, do you use your power tyrannically, so to speak? Do you become the new sole source of authority, or do you exercise a kind of leadership that invites other people in and that aims to widen the circle of people involved in the conversation? So I agree that it's tricky. I mean, you know, when you're picketing Maury's, that's sort of like you have to meet power with power. It's not helpful to. Well, maybe, I mean, it would be interesting to ask what it would mean to stand outside the door and empower female law students to enter, for example. But so how do we, I think of it as good parenting and bad parenting. You know, are you a parent who invites your kids to become adults?
Or who forever silences them and
Right.
cows
Yeah.
them?
Right.
I'm conscious of time. Do I have until 7:15 or?
Like 7:05.
7:05, okay. So one of the questions that you and I had talked about, or we had scripted for this case, was what was to actually engage for a moment, a little bit theoretically, about what you actually thought feminism was nowadays. Feminism had a certain clear definition in the earlier phases, but now it's more common to speak of feminisms. And so the question is, do you believe that plurality around definitions of feminism is good and empowering, or on some level has that dissipated the energies of feminism so that people no longer know what it is that they're rallying for? So a two-part question. What it is and how the lack of clarity around it is good or bad?
Well, I have a bumper sticker that reads, "Feminism is the radical notion that women are people." And I think to me, that's a pretty good statement of what feminism is. I see feminism as a social movement, a movement for social change in the direction of the recognition of the full humanity of all women. So there are a number of elements to that. That feminism is a social movement, it's not a lifestyle. So to be a feminist is to work for change. It's to work for change in terms of recognizing the full humanity of all women, not just a particular group of women. And it's to say that women are full human beings and simply human beings. It's a critique of both worldviews that would subordinate women, but also the kind of apologetic that women don't need halakha, for example, because we're naturally more religious than men. That also is a violation of women's single personhood. So I think there's a tremendous amount of there's room for a tremendous amount of argument within that about what the recognition of women's humanity means. Does it mean the ordination of women? Does it mean the total transformation of Judaism? And you just look at the Jewish case. And I think it's great that there are many feminisms, provided we understand feminism as a movement for social change.
Well, one of the aspects of the plural, I suppose the pluralism within feminism is the critique of the very categories of man and woman.
Right.
And that insisting on those categories on some level can be dehumanizing. The problem with that, one might argue, is that once you theorize around what is a man and what is a woman, you're spending a lot of time offering those theoretical notions, and there might be political issues right there on the ground that are not being addressed. So, and I would say, and here I'm going to speak a little bit more off the cuff and be honest with you, in our preparations for the Kallah, you witnessed something of a concern on the part of some students that the issues of feminism really were spent. We've exhausted them. Certainly within the liberal movement, what was there really to talk about anymore? We've enfranchised men and women equally. And so what makes it relevant anymore? Or what lends urgency to this enterprise? Is it too quaint to talk about women being people? And is the next generation really the next set of teachings really not so much about women anymore, but about other marginalized groups and broadening the feminist cause that includes others?
Well, first of all, if you take seriously the notion that feminism is about the recognition of the personhood of all women, then feminism has to intersect with other social movements. Anti-racism, anti-homophobia, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that that's part of being a feminist. It's not that those things are separate, and that doesn't mean that the relationship's easy. So I think that one of the things that feminism has learned from the queer movement is that feminists, and I include myself in this, have took for granted for a long time the gender binary. And when I use the word women, I can hear myself being locked into the gender binary. And I think that critiquing the gender binary is an important piece of feminism. And yet at the same time, we live in a society which defines people as women, and in which expectations are laid on people as a result of being women. So I think that the category of woman is important still as an organizing tool. At the same time that we have to hold it lightly and critique it in a way that wasn't true 20 years ago.
And maybe out of our sense of strength and commitment,
Right.
we have the ability to engage in those theoretical discussions because we feel that we won't lose everything all at once. So apropos of the enduring relevance of the category of woman, this summer, for those of you might have caught this in the PowerPoint presentation with Brandon's reference to her cool name, and Anne-Marie Slaughter renewed a discussion about homework balance that really had come also in those earliest years of feminism, the beginning in 1970 with Alice Kate Shulman's marriage agreement, which I noticed was reprinted in this month's edition of Lilith magazine. So the Lilith editors must, as they were reading Anne-Marie Slaughter, they wanted to go, hey, someone else talked about this before. But this summer there was a tremendous attention focused on this article by Anne-Marie Slaughter. She was a former State Department official, former dean of the Woodrow Wilson School of Princeton. She's a faculty member at Princeton, and she wrote this controversial article suggesting that some 40 years later, we still haven't figured out how, despite women's great attainments in the workforce, how to affect a proper homework balance, and that in the current configuration, women cannot have it all. I was wondering if you wanted to comment. on the article and its conclusions, and maybe even on this idea of having it all. Because I'm not so sure that anyone can have it all other than
right. Okay.
God.
Right. What I liked about the Anne Marie Slaughter article is that she directed our attention back to institutional structure. And I think that, this is a piece of the second wave that's gotten lost. That when we talked about women entering the workplace, we weren't talking about women entering the workplace within social structures as currently defined. We wanted daycare centers in every workplace. We wanted shared jobs. We wanted flex time. I mean, I love what Anne Marie Slaughter said about changing the school day. Hey, so I think that to pay attention again to this institutional level that we've really lost track of, putting the burden on individuals to figure out how to put their lives together within our crazy structure.
In my house, we've had an ongoing discussion about this article, and I really like this article. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read it, I believe that we were going to circulate it, or if we haven't already. And there are a number of very important social critiques that are offered in this article that are relevant to anyone who's going to be taking on a serious job in the future, as many of you are going to be. But the question of women having it all, for women having it all, it's not what upset us in our family, in our house, is it's not about women having it all, but it's about people having it all. How can you be a responsible professional and also be a responsible parent or a member of a family? How can you nurture and care for the people who are entrusted to you, and that's not, somehow we're still thinking that this is a women's problem, and we have not yet acknowledged there are many men who do not want to be forced into a situation where it's assumed that it doesn't matter to them to be at home with their kids. Okay, so I want to make sure that we have some time for you all to ask questions. So the last question that I wanted to ask you formally is perhaps to reflect, given this 40-year milestone, 40 years since Ms. Magazine was founded, that's another milestone, since Debbie Friedman, since Sally Priesand, since the conservative movement being pressured to reckon with the force of women. I'll note for those of you who are not at graduation this year, at ordination, Angela Bookdahl gave a beautiful, really historic address in which she reflected on 40 years and what 40 years might mean symbolically in Judaism, that 40 years is a generation, and 40 years was the time during which we wandered in the desert and when we were ready to enter the promised land. So are we about to enter the feminist promised land? Or not, and what is it that we still need to accomplish so that we can reach that holy destination?
Well, first, I think it's important to remember, first of all, that the promised land wasn't really much of a promised land. That may be the first thing to say. It had a lot of the same issues as the wilderness. But I think, if we think of some basic aspects of the feminist promised land, that everyone is treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their gender, sex, income, age, sexuality, etc. That people are neither excluded from nor assigned to particular roles based on supposedly innate characteristics, that all Jews have the opportunity to shape the communal agenda, that our images of God reflect the diversity of the community, that the important turning points in all our lives are marked and celebrated, that the patriarchal nature of Torah is acknowledged and addressed in an ongoing way, that there's a daycare center in every synagogue and JCC in the country. That's just some, initial signs of what would be a promised land that I don't think we've quite achieved.
So we closed the PowerPoint presentation with a question mark in a desire to elicited a response from all of you and a sense of investment, you know, an ongoing investment in these questions. So since I managed to shut up on time, we have some time for questions. For those of you who feel that there were issues addressed in the PowerPoint that you would like to refer to, or if you have questions for Judith Plaskow that I didn't get to. Hannah.
Hi, I'm Hannah Goldstein. I'm a fifth-year rabbinical student. So I guess my question is, this is now my second gender Kallah. Really excited. My question is, we talk a lot in Rabbi Hoffman's classes about having new conversations, and I'm wondering, like, Slaughter's article is in many ways, just like you said, it's not new. So how do we have different conversations when, you know, this is an opportunity when we sit and really intensively think about it. We talk about it all the time, but how do we say something different than what we've said a lot of times before? I want to see the conversation move forward or move in a different direction and not just say, I'm nervous about being a woman rabbi, I'm worried about work-life balance. Like, how do we do it in a different way?
I mean, partly what you're pointing to is that the problems haven't changed. So how do you have a new conversation about them? I mean, I guess I really feel like there needs to be another round of consciousness raising. I can't say how important that was in generating the feminist agenda, that people sat in small groups and talked about the substance of their lives and the satisfactions and dissatisfactions of their lives and looked at them in relation to the larger social structures and asked, well, how do we create the world in which we want to live? And I think the way to do that is to begin with those personal fears, but then, and what are the issues for this generation? They're not going to be the same as they were, you know, in the consciousness raising group. Some of them will be the same and some of them won't be the same. But I think what makes it new is the move towards activism. And, you know, well, what do we need to do now to begin to make what we hope for real?
The conversation is about feminism, and I think sometimes people think that feminism excludes men to some degree. And I wonder whether you have any pictures for us of what I might call feminist forefathers. I think that might be an interesting category.
I think feminist forefathers, actually in our small group, one of the men in the group was talking about a feminist forbear, a man who defined himself as a feminist and talked about why and how important that was for him. And I think that, you know, with any movement for social change, members of the dominant group often have more powerful voices in identifying with the issues and articulating some of the issues. So I think that any man who interrupts the kind of everyday sexism that takes place, you know, in a lot of our institutions, or stands up and says, I'm a feminist, is a feminist forebear. Feminist.
The same thing happened in my reflection group. One of the students commented on his father's conscientious objection of rabbinical seminaries that didn't accept women, and therefore his decision to attend HUC at that time. And if you read the Anna Marie Slaughter article, you'll notice that the feminist hero of that article is her husband, or any number of the men who actually enabled the women to be responsible parents.
April, if you said that even one day it came to you that you had to sort of re-envision the symbols of God, Torah, and Israel. It was an interesting statement, and while we've been having this conversation, I've actually been thinking it's time. feminism has to have that same re-envisionment. Even the word feminism, I mean, it doesn't fit me, and I'm very sympathetic, but our ideas of gender and women and roles and what we want and how we do it, like, it's time. There needs to be a new paradigm. There need to be new symbols. There needs to be a way to have this conversation in a new way, in a way that involves people in a new way. I have no idea how to do that. Just what I was thinking.
Start with consciousness. Start with consciousness.
Nikki Block, Judith Plaskow. I wonder also what consciousness raising means in a blogging society where it's all, every single person's individual story is just as important and so, the most unique, right? Like we need a superlative for unique now. How do you find a connection? And how do you find a connection without playing the number game? I keep thinking, and I've been talking about this over the past couple of days, about Gordon Tucker, rabbi in the conservative movement, about his takana on sexuality issues, where he says at the end, it doesn't matter how many queer Jews there are. It doesn't matter how many are in your synagogue. It just matters the truth about that one person, which is beautiful, except if consciousness raising is about seeing how your personal story reflects a sociological or a political or a theological, a structural problem, right, then you have to make connections between one story and another. So I wonder, what would consciousness raising look like now?
That's a very interesting question, because in a blogging society, people need to be in a room together. I think that's the first thing, to sit down and actually talk to each other face to face, rather than just having stories out there in the ether.
You're a new face. You'll have to introduce yourself.
My name is Jay O'Brien. I'm a cantorial student. My question is about crafting your personal theology and also balancing that between collaborating with others in different trajectory Jewish communities. And so you mentioned something about violation of halakha and the idea of women not being bound to traditional practice of halakha. So in kind of attempting to collaborate with maybe Israeli feminist causes, do you see like any way that you'd have to maybe maneuver or augment your personal theology and package that in a way for collaboration?
Well, but that collaborative feminism.
No, the notion of women being not having the same status because of their exclusion
Well, in Ezra Nashim.
Yeah.
So I suppose the question is, I guess because feminism holds as a tenet collaboration, you end up having to make certain compromises if you're wanting to work with groups of people that fervently hold opposing beliefs.
Well, it was interesting that the first Jewish Women's Conference in 1972, there were 400 women from across the Jewish spectrum, from secular to Orthodox, and we were going to have Shabbat morning services. And were we going to count ourselves as a minyan? And, a number of us were up most of the night trying to figure out how we were going to do that. And we reached an agreement that when women were called to the Torah, or they said Kaddish or not say Kaddish, that they would decide which blessing whether they were going to say the full blessing, that we would say Kaddish, and that people could reply or not, depending on whether they counted themselves in the minyan. Now, and it worked very well. It was incredibly moving and powerful. What's really interesting to me is that you couldn't do that anymore, because the Orthodox women present would feel that simply by being in the room and going along with that, that they were going to be delegitimated in their own community. So I think that, that it's been very sad to me that it's become more and more difficult not to meet together and have conversations, but to worship together. It's gotten much harder.
One more? Okay, we can take one more question from Yael.
Hi, my name is Yael, and I'm a third-year rabbinical student, and I just thought of this question based on your commentary, that this is the first year that a group of women will be ordained as maharat from an Orthodox seminary. And though there are plenty of rabbot, there are Reform women who call themselves rabbah, there are some conservative women who call themselves rabbah, and there's one Orthodox woman who calls herself rabbah. I was wondering your perspective on the title of maharat versus rabbah. Is it, an empowering title that indicates, this is a job for a woman, or is this a step backwards that there are Rav and there's rabbah, and we're not ready yet for a rabbah in Orthodox congregations?
Well, it's certainly not a step backward, because it's incredibly exciting that there are women who have access to that education and are filling roles in the Orthodox community that women have never played. To me, it's separate and unequal.
Okay, so I'm sorry, my colleague to my right, Dr. Lawrence Hoffman, would like to say something, and to see if we can get.
I just feel moved to say what a historic moment it is to have you here. I remember you so well when I began teaching. Well, we know each other, of course, but as somebody who was sort of there at the time, I need to say how important you were to me back then, and have remained to me ever since. And not everybody goes back that far, and so it's easy for us to go home and say, well, we had interesting guests, what happened at Kallah, and then we went to something else. But for me, there is no something else except moving forward on the question that you led us to in the first place. And so to tell you, and I hope to impress upon everyone here, this is one of those great historic moments which we're honoring a great thinker and the beginning of a great movement. And I, for myself, from the bottom of my heart, I thank God I'm just simply here to see you among us, and I thank you, and thank you.
Thank you.
What we did want to do, building on the energy of this moment, and the fact that some of you are sitting on at the edges of your seats and want to say something, we affixed big pieces of paper on the walls in the hope that if there were questions that you feel were not addressed or issues that are nagging at you, that you can pick up a Sharpie and write them down. And we want to keep a log of these ideas as they come up so that we can address them directly in the closing session on Tuesday. Thank you very much, everybody.